Okay. Okay, can we come back together? Our reading as we start a brief Advent series is from John chapter 1. It's on page 1063 if you're looking at the red, I suppose, Bibles that are there in front of you. John chapter 1, verses 1 to 5. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all humanity. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. We thank God for his word in Scripture. So we begin our countdown to Christmas, both in terms of Advent Sundays and, if you're opening calendars, it is the 1st of December, so you've probably started there. Les, a moment ago, described the church as a mini United Nations, and we could, if we checked in with each other, discover various different cultural traditions of celebrating Christmas. Some are quite ancient, we'll see in a moment, putting out stockings or if you were born in Central Europe, shoes to be filled with presents goes a long way back. Some are surprisingly recent. Advent wreaths, Advent wreaths, for instance, arrived in the UK about 1970, when it seems the idea was introduced from Scandinavia via a Blue Peter craft project. I got this from a senior liturgist in the Church of England, a bishop. I'd got the date, he told me it was Blue Peter. And I've been saying ever since we need a black and white candles in memory of Shep, and I'm really pleased we've got them this year. If you're too young, Shep was a dog who was part of the iconic and definitive Blue Peter team. Some Christmas traditions are even controversial, watching Die Hard or Love Actually. Die Hard because people disagree whether it's really a Christmas movie, and Love Actually because it's rubbish. And then there are things that could have become Christmas traditions, but somehow didn't. Punching people in the face during church meetings. I'll come back to that. One of the things, of course, we discover is differences about the date of gift giving. In the UK, traditionally, it's the 25th, Christmas Day. Many countries, it's 24th, Christmas Eve. In parts of Europe and other places, it's St. Nicholas's Day, the 6th Friday of this coming week. You probably know that the name Santa Claus is a corruption of St. Nicholas. That's a long-standing American Christmas tradition of taking something powerful and meaningful that an immigrant community brought with them and rendering it trivial and commercial. But, I wonder, however, if you know who St. Nicholas was and what he has to do with our passage from John this morning. We're talking about St. Nicholas of Myra. I have a slide here, perhaps, Clayton. That's Myra, what's left of it. Really remarkable rock tombs. It's on the southern coast of what's now Turkey. And St. Nicholas of Myra, there's another guy who some of you will know called St. Nicholas of Lyra, which is really unhelpful. But our Nicholas was born about 270 AD. The stories that have come down to us tell that his parents died while he was young, and taking seriously Jesus' words about selling whatever you have and giving the money to the poor, he soon gave away his whole inheritance. One story concerns an impoverished father with 3 daughters who'd reached marriageable age, but at the time, no one would marry a young woman who didn't have a dowry, some money to bring to start the family. And it seemed they had no good future because he had no money. Nicholas heard about this, crept up to the house at night and threw a bag of gold coins through the window. The stories say that these landed in a stocking hung up to dry in front of the fire, or perhaps in a shoe, giving us one of our more ancient Christian traditions of stockings or shoes. 325 AD, Nicholas is Bishop of Myra and present at a big council gathering of bishops called to discuss how we should understand the relationship of the word in our passage here, the logos in Greek, to the Father. How do we make sense of that very first verse we read? The word was with God, and the word was God. Seem very difficult things to say together. I can say I was with Abby, but I'd never say I was with Steve, because I am Steve, it'd be weird. What's going on here? Now, we know Nicholas was at this council from the best ancient sources, and we know which side of the argument he was on. The rest of the story I'm just about to tell you is almost certainly not true. Later invention. Our first source for it dates about 1,000 years, just over after Nicholas's time, but it's fun. Person on trial at the council was called Arius. He was a priest from North Africa, from Egypt. Arius read a line from our text that we've just heard. The word was with God, to mean that the word, the logos, was different from God the Father. He then read what our Bibles have as the word was God, as meaning something like the word was a God, a divine being, but a different and lesser divine being than God the Father. Finally, he read in the beginning as being an echo of Genesis 1, which it almost certainly is. And so he thought that this was about creation and taught that the Word was God the Father's first creation. And then through the Word, God created everything else, as the text says. Now, the story, probably not true, remember, goes that Arius was explaining all this at the council. And Nicholas was getting angrier and angrier because he thought he was dishonoring Jesus. And eventually, Nicholas jumped up from his seat, strode across the room, and to quote the earliest source, an Italian bishop writing in 1370, out of zeal for the true faith, struck him on the jaw. Now, the sources do not tell whether this was a quick jab or a solid right hook. And disappointingly, the later depictions, there's one on the screen, we have in religious art, show a slap open-handed rather than a punch. There is a very recent cartoon version of St. Nicholas's life done by an Orthodox priest who clearly really believes in these things. A solid punch that knocks Arius to the floor, and then in the other panel on the right, you'll notice he's kicking him in the ribs while he's lying on the ground. There's no textual evidence at all for that, and anyway, it's against the Queensberry rules. Well, punching people in formal church councils was not generally approved of back then. And Nicholas was stripped of his bishop's robe, his pallium, and his Bible, the things that marked him out as a bishop, and thrown into a cell overnight. In the middle of the night, the story goes, Jesus appeared to him in the cell and said, "Why are you in prison?" And Nicholas answered, "For my love for you, Lord." And then Jesus gave him a pallium, a robe, and a Bible, and reinstated him as a bishop. Almost certainly never happened, but a nice story that could be better remembered in our Christmas traditions. We could rewrite some of the songs, not so much deck the halls as deck the heretics. He sees you when you're sleeping. He knows when you're awake. He knows if you've been denying the consubstantiality of the Son. So be orthodox, for goodness sake. I saw Mama kissing Santa Claus could have another verse. I saw Santa punching Arius. We could use this story to justify Die Hard as a Christmas movie. Bruce Willis uses guns and explosives mostly, but Bonnie Bedelia's character, Holly, lands an impressive punch on the jaw of the unscrupulous reporter late on in the film. I take the story to give very good ideas of how to deal with anyone who tells you to watch Love Actually. And it even supports my firm belief that Fairy Tale of New York remains the greatest Christmas song ever. Anyway, back to John. Whether it descended into violence or not, The debate that Arius and Nicholas were part of in this council was about how we understand this text, how we understand the relationship between Jesus and the one he called Father. You see, the key point of what gets called the prologue to John's Gospel, the first 18 verses of chapter 1, is in verse 14. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling amongst us. And someone else gets to preach on that verse, so I won't. But we need to notice it because everything John wants to tell us about the Word, the Logos, in these verses all finds its purpose, its point, its meaning when we get to the Word became flesh and made our neighborhood his home. John's about to take us very, very local. In verse 19, after the prologue, we go to John the Baptist, who we were just hearing from the kids about, who is outside a little village called Bethany, according to verse 28, where John was baptizing. Now, when that says little village, don't think Strathkinnis or Darcy or Kingsbarns. Don't even think Blebo. Think maybe 20, 30 houses. Fewer than 200 people. Think the sort of place that these days doesn't really get a name. The cluster of houses and farms between Rufflets and the Strathkinnis Crossroads on the low road, or those on the road just beneath Craigton Park before the new ones got built there. That sort of little cluster of dwellings. When John tells us that the Word became flesh and made his home with us, he doesn't mean the UK, Scotland, Fife, St Andrews even. He means next door, your road. He moved in close enough that your kids' balls would land in his garden when they were playing in the summer. That you'd get your bins mixed up when they came to collect them. That your pets would spend more time in his garden than yours. That you'd know his taste in music because the flat walls weren't thick enough to keep it out. When John says the Word became flesh and dwelt amongst us, he really, really means the amongst. But someone else gets to preach on verse 14. John is about to take us very local, but he begins as expansive as he's about to get specific. In the beginning, and we can get clever here, and perhaps we should, beginning in the Greek is arche, and it means both origin and source. Beginning here, but also ruler. So when we talk about a monarchy, we mean a single ruler. That's what a monarchy is, a nation with a single ruler. In the beginning, yes, Jesus was there before all time in the beginning. But John wants to tell us what Nicholas believed and Arius didn't, that Jesus was, is, always will be on the throne and as the cause. God reigns over all, and the God who reigns over all is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. God creates all, and the God who creates all is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. This is what Nicholas got worked up about, according to the story. Who is on the throne of heaven? Is it the triune God? Or is it the Father alone? Even if the Son has a slightly smaller throne, just one step down on the dais, the Word, the Logos, Jesus, John wants to say, was with God in the arche, with God on the throne. The Word is God in the arche. Jesus is God on the throne. And Jesus, this Jesus, moves in next door. I've been preaching for nearly 35 years, and one of my fairly early sermons was on this passage. And I said then, there aren't any good illustrations. And 3 decades and some later, there still aren't any good illustrations. Back then we lived in London, and a friend of ours taught at the cathedral choir school that was attached to Westminster Cathedral, and there was a royal visit to the cathedral that they hadn't been told about in advance in the school, presumably security reasons. And she told us one day that hurrying from one class to the next, she turned a familiar corner in a corridor she walked every day and saw in front of her the late Queen. But that doesn't begin to get close to what John's talking about. Queen Elizabeth, for all her majesty, reigned on a temporary, limited, earthly throne, and she'd come on a brief royal visit to the cathedral, fairly quickly to withdraw back to the palace. Jesus is God on the eternal heavenly throne, and Jesus doesn't just visit briefly, but moves in next door. Then again, who is the source of all things? And John goes on to make this utterly clear. All things were made through him, he says, and just in case you missed it, he says this again. Without him, nothing was made. All things through Jesus. The one moving in next door created the stars, the galaxies, yes, and your home and next door too. And you. And there still aren't any illustrations. In him was life, and that life was the light of humanity. Life and light are going to be big themes in all that John's got to say to us through the gospel, and they just appear here briefly. But he is life. All that is good, all that is living, all that is generative, all that is growing, all that is thriving is in him. And that is the light of truth, the light of hope, light which the darkness has not overcome. Sorry, second Greek word, I don't usually do this, but that the darkness has not overcome it. Again, grasp maybe would be in English, because the word means both understood and defeated. The darkness doesn't know the light, can't imagine the reality of the light. The darkness has not overcome, defeated the light. The light remains. Light in darkness remains unknown but unbeaten. We lit a candle and spoke of hope. Hope here is the light still shining, the light still undefeated if not understood. The light is the promise of utter transformation. The promise that when there seems no hope, when it feels like there's no possibility, then the one who sits on the throne, the one who made all things, has come and will come again. Moves in next door and changes every possibility. Say, I don't suspect the story about Nicholas and Aries is true, and obviously I don't condone violence as a way to address theological questions. St. Mary's would be more exciting, but we might have problems with the principal. I've heard students say all sorts of things down the years, and I tend to try to raise my eyebrows, not the roof. I did once, actually, years ago, fear that two of my students were about to come to blows. They had a very heated disagreement. One asked if animals would be in heaven, which I didn't think this was going into dangerous territory when she asked it, but that's where we were. And her neighbour very quickly asserted confidently that the Catechism of the Roman Catholic Church says no, which it does. The first student took this as a personal insult to her pet dog, who was clearly the only one she'd ever been able to trust during difficult teenage years, and who had died the day before. She told us at some length how wonderful this dog was, and then told the other student exactly where she could put her catechism. It turned out the second student was as committed to her dogma as the first was to her dog, and things went downhill fairly rapidly. I had to intervene. Violence is not the answer, and violence is never necessary, because Jesus is the one who is on the throne, the one who made all things. The astonishing image at the end of Revelation 21 where Satan is freed and marches the earth and gathers an army so great that no one can count. And eventually this army marches on the encampment, the little refugee camp of the people of God. And there's only one possible outcome. Not because an immense army marching on a refugee camp with a single wire for its fence is not going to be stopped, but because this is the camp of the people of God. And so there's no fighting. Fighting would suggest there was a contest. The text says fire fell from heaven and devoured them. And that's it. We don't need to fight because there's no contest. The light is shining still, shining in the darkness, however dark the darkness gets. The light is shining still, shining with hope, shining with truth. The light is shining still. And the light, because it is Jesus, the one who is seated on the throne, the one who made all things. The light will never be overcome, even if it will never be understood. Someone asked me about 3 years back what the greatest sermon I had ever heard was, and my immediate response was to say, well, I've heard lots of good sermons in lots of good contexts, and lots of them were great. But then I suddenly thought, no, I know what the greatest sermon I ever heard was. It was preached by Leslie Newbigin, who some of you will have heard of. He was a missionary for many years in India, and then came back to Britain. He'd gone out as a Church of Scotland minister, had become a bishop while he was in India, which was a bit unfortunate in the Church of Scotland, so he came back and joined the Church of England. But he came back to the UK and wrote a series of books which are still read, still valuable, pointing out that the UK was just as pagan, just as unchristian a culture as anything he'd ever met in India, and that we needed to understand how the gospel was going to make sense in the UK. Well, he preached this sermon. It was Spurgeon's College, where at the time I was teaching there. It was a little after I'd finished my own studies there. And right at the end of his life, at this point, Leslie's completely blind. He's so bent, so short that behind what back then was quite a large lectern in the college chapel, he virtually disappears. And he started by saying to us, addressing the students, you're soon going to go out into ministry. What are you going to do? And he said, some people will want you to be a social worker. And he told a couple of funny stories from his own ministry. And then he said, but there are people who are trained and paid to be social workers, and they do it better than you do. Don't do that. Counsellor. Citizens Advice Bureau, psychoanalyst. He went on and on. Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that. 27.5 minutes of this. It was very funny. And then he stopped and he said, so what should you do? And with a smile that seemed to light up most of South London, he said, tell them about Jesus. Tell them about the wonderful thing that God has done. And he sat down. That's simple. The light shines in the darkness. And because the Word was with God, and because the Word is God, the light is all that is needed. Tell them about Jesus. Tell them about the wonderful thing that God has done. And then you can sit down, because it's all done. Everything that matters. You can even, if you must, watch Love Actually, but don't invite me around. We're going to sing. You were the Word in the beginning. What a beautiful name it is.